We have an insatiable need to know all the goss, so we went straight to the source, actor Sam Reid, for the lowdown on everything to do with the new season. Sam Reid, welcome to Stop Everything.
Thanks very much for having me.
Every episode of The Newsreader is about the personal and professional dramas of your character Dale Jennings and Helen Norville, played by Anna Torv. But it's also about the big stories of the day, specifically the mid-1980s. Now, I think our maths are right here, but you would have been like 1 year old in real life at the time of these stories. So how familiar were you with the headlines we're talking about, like Halley's Comet, Lindy Chamberlain, Chernobyl, at least with season 1?
Yeah, not really familiar at all, to be honest. I mean, I knew, obviously, Lindy Chamberlain and things like that come up, but things like the Russell Street bombing and some of the events that happened in season 2, I wasn't across them at all. So, it was a really fun dive into Australian history, and we get this fantastic pack at the start of every season with all of the archival footage, all of the news stories of the time, lots of history. So it's a bit of an eye-opener. It's always so shocking that so much can happen in a year.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being super surprised watching the first season that it was all happening in that same year. And I actually jumped on Wikipedia straight away and went, that can't be right. This has got to be some sort of creative massaging. But no, it was just a really dramatic year. During those first conversations about the character of Dale and the show, what compelled you to join up?
There's a few reasons. Firstly, it was during COVID and I was spending a lot of time watching the news. And you start to get to know these newsreaders that you're watching every single day and relying on. And I just thought it was such a fascinating concept to sort of delve into their private lives and their backstory, really. And I thought that was really interesting framework that Michael presented. And then also, I was just so sort of shocked that they asked me to do it.
Why were you shocked?
I'd never played a character like Dale before. I was really excited about the opportunity to play this sort of naive, bandy-eyed, ambitious dork. And I just really identified with him. I understood, when you make the mistake constantly by second-guessing yourself. And I just saw how much he was trying so hard to sort of get out of his own head. And I thought that was a really lovely element in the character. And I was excited to play it.
We want to talk so much more about this bandy-eyed dork that you played, Dale Jennings, soon. But we really also want to talk about season 2, which has just started on ABC TV and iView. This season looks into Indigenous recognition and other things that are happening around the time of 1987 this time around. What other events are we going to see covered in season 2?
The election, we see the bicentenary, the Hoddle Street Massacre. Yeah, that's as many as I can think of right now. I don't have them in front of me. Oh, Princess Diana. It's jam-packed as per usual.
I loved the Princess Diana subplot because I was going through your IMDb listing and you once played Prince Harry.
I did, yeah.
I mean, I'm guessing these versions don't exist in the same cinematic universe.
No. I once played Prince Harry being abducted by the Taliban, much to the chagrin of the Daily Mail at the time. I think everyone was very, very pissed off that that thing existed.
Does that feel like a lifetime ago now? Do you think about that role every time Harry's in the news?
I don't think about it that much. Yeah, it was a lifetime. I think I was just finished drama school.
You mentioned that this season we're going to be looking at the bicentennial celebrations, and that also covers that Indigenous recognition that we're talking about. That episode will air about 2 weeks before the referendum vote in real life here this year. Do you feel like the newsreader is tapping into that wider conversation?
I think that's more of a question for Michael Lucas than it is for me, because I'm not sure if there was a conscious decision to tap into that broader conversation. I hope it does. I hope it changes some people's minds. But I think the interesting thing about a show like this set in the 80s is we can reflect on how far we've come and how far we haven't come and how much things haven't changed in 30 years. I think it's really interesting to always use period pieces as a means to be able to process how far society is developing or if it's not developing. It's kind of shocking when you can relate to what somebody was going through in 1987 in 2023.
Yeah, when I watched that episode, and without going too much into the detail of it, because obviously we want people to see that episode for themselves. There were some lines of dialogue that I thought, wow, people are still saying that today. Isn't that shocking? It's been over 30 years and it's just playing out in the news cycle as if it was 1987 still. It's an incredible episode, but yeah, I'm really excited for everyone to see that episode in particular.
Yeah, it is kind of shocking, isn't it? The fact that so many people can identify with the misogyny in the workplace and feeling trapped under patriarchal systems, and, that Helen and Dale are. And you can relate to that in a contemporary context, I think is one of the strengths of the show.
Let's talk more about the workplace of News at 6, which is the fictional universe in which you play Dale. It mirrors so many newsrooms of that era. Misogyny, homophobia is rife. Bullying seems so prevalent that it's just seen as a normal part of that workplace. What felt most interesting or bizarre to you about newsrooms of that era?
I mean, all of those things that you just said. It was sort of shocking. Lindsay is such an intense character, and the amount of people who've said to me, particularly people who work in news, that they had a boss like Lindsay, he's exactly how it was, is sort of insane to me that people could get away with that level of daily abuse, of like full-on aggression in the workroom. Yeah, I mean, that is kind of insane. It's also interesting when you think about that news also has to be entertaining. And I think there's this kind of thing that we forget, that when you're watching the news, you expect it to just be the most important, most straightforward news stories of the day to keep you informed. But actually, it's also about keeping ratings and making it entertaining and making television. It is still a television show, the news. And they are still competing with other networks to hold your attention and sell advertising. Not on the ABC, obviously. But.
No, never on the ABC. But yeah, that remit or that balance between entertainment and news, it is such an interesting dynamic that I think the show does so well in exploring, because, when you work in the news, you do get a lot of commentary from people who don't work in the news. They roll their eyes and they go, oh, the news is just like so soft now. There's nothing worth watching. It's like, you guys are kind of responsible for this as well.
I mean, I always think about the news fueling this kind of like generational anxiety, because we're all so obsessed with the news now, because obviously there's just constantly horrific events happening on a daily basis. And I like to connect that to Dale and think about this kid who just grew up watching the news, was obsessed with the news, spent his whole life watching the news. And so he's kind of got this sort of undercurrent of consistent anxiety fueled from all of these sort of 24-hour news cycle horrific events that we all get.
I really love that depiction of Dale's obsession with the news, especially in season 1, where you see him with all those VHS tapes where he's just been studying the news and how it's presented over and over again. Can we talk about Dale more? Creator Michael Lucas has said that a big part of the story is exploring the struggle with one's emerging sexuality and gender stereotype conformity. And that really feels like it all focuses so much on Dale and Helen, of course, too. But to what extent is Dale wrestling with the strictures and confines of Australian masculinity of this era?
I mean, quite a lot. I think the really interesting way that the show examines this is by framing it through newsreaders who you expect to be sort of archetypal cardboard figures in a way, who can convey the most important messages to the Australian public in the most relatable and trustworthy way. And Dale is not at all in touch with himself, or hasn't really worked out who he is, and is on that sort of discovery, but he's shoving all of that questioning that he has about himself and who he is down so he can present this very stable, put together cardboard copy of a man, of what he thinks society thinks that they want a man to be. I love the fact that we always get to see him practicing that, because it's kind of an interesting thing to ask, is like, there's elements of gender which can be performative, and, you see Dale performing his conception of what he thinks a man should be, and then you see it kind of like progressively throughout the show as he reads the news.
Is that something you can relate to yourself? You've got a public-facing role. You've got to present yourself for interviews like this, and then there's obviously a different version of characters that you play. Do you feel like sometimes you are performing as well?
Yeah, I perform as my job.
Yes.
So yeah. But It's an interesting question. I mean, I think what Emma Freeman does so wonderfully in all of her work, and particularly in this show, is she examines the public and the private persona. And obviously characters like newsreaders, where there is such a huge public persona, gives you a lot of space to kind of explore what the private person is compared to the public person. And you can really expand on that and make these two very different versions of the one person. And yeah, I think it's incredibly relatable, and I understand that very well. When you have, who you are at home, when you're not thinking about any camera or being recorded or how this piece of information that you're putting out into the public sphere is going to be digested, because you just speak freely because you're not being permanently recorded, as how you are when you do have that lens on you, and what happens to you when the spotlight is put on you.
And Dale isn't the only person subjected to these really rigid terms of Australian masculinity. I mean, Dale is applauded when he demonstrates seemingly masculine traits. Helen is punished for them, and we're going to see that this season especially. Let's talk more about their relationship to each other, because it's quite an interesting and complicated relationship. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the first season of The Newsreader, but Dale and Helen become romantically involved. But we also discover Dale is attracted to men. Now, help me out, Sam, because my read is that Dale genuinely loves Helen, possibly bisexual. Others I know have watched the show and read it as Dale is closeted gay and kind of using Helen as a bit of a beard. What's your read on the situation?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to give a firm answer on what I think Dale's sexuality is, because I believe that he needs time to work it out, and we do continue to explore it throughout the show. But yeah, he's definitely in love with Helen, no question. And he definitely has an attraction to men and has been with men and has probably been in love with a man, at least one. So I think that's that. But I think what I find really interesting about the show and exploring Dale's sexuality is the fact that this thing that you're just saying comes up, where people just say, oh no, he's gay and he's closeted and he hasn't dealt with it and he's using. And there's an element of prejudice there against a more fluid sexuality, which I think he, once you get through even just the prejudice that he feels because he's been with a man, he also has the prejudice because he's been with a man and a woman. And so, he's constantly battling this space where he doesn't feel like he fits anywhere. And that's the element that he has with Tim from season 1. Tim is saying, you're gay, Dale, this is what you need to do. You need to get away and start a new life and you're going to find your feet. And Dale's like, yeah, but I also love Helen, and I think we're very different. I don't think we have the same sexuality, and I think there's a big, broad spectrum of sexuality, which I think that's what I love about Dale, is because you don't have to answer it. We don't have to give a clear answer. And I think also, particularly because it's 1987, there was not really the language for him to discover that. And he's working in such a rigid environment to even really understand what bisexuality is or what pansexuality is or maybe demisexual. There's a lot of potential for how he might feel, but there's no space for him to explore it. And so you're just watching this character work it out on his own. In season 2, you do get to see him, he makes a friend, which I think he really needs, and you do get to see him sort of work it out a bit more.
I love that.
I mean, it sounds like, and I have seen a few episodes, that you get to play all these great, rich character arcs and explore these wonderful themes around him. What were some of those conversations like with Michael, with the other writers between 1 and 2? Did you express a certain desire to explore different aspects of Dale?
Yeah, I did, because I love Dale and he is a really good guy, but the environment in which he's working in is incredibly toxic and he really wants to be there. And what I was most curious about exploring was, if this guy really wants to be here, well, he's not going to survive if he just stays a good guy. And so when does Dale start to compromise his own personal ethics to advance his career? And so you start to see, we actually called him Dead Dale.
I was about to call him Dale Goes Dark.
Yeah, we call him that. Because, he has to sell us all a part of himself. He's got to let that go to kind of get to where he thinks he wants to be. And it's sad, really.
Because at the end of the day, what's at stake for him? What does he want and what's in his way?
Well, God, what isn't in his way? A lot of what is in his way is his own design. But then he's also battling this incredibly patriarchal environment in which he's working. And he has to pretend every single day to be something that he isn't. And that's not going to be very good for anyone.
That does sound like there's so much great deep character work, but the show is also really fun as well. Let's talk about the 1980s setting. I want to talk about the costumes, the production design, the cars. Like, what's your favorite piece on the show to play with?
I love the technology. I love the tech. I always get so obsessed with all the TVs and the cables, and I usually end up just getting on eBay between takes and just like looking up 1980s televisions and, just trying to buy them. We have a fantastic crew who work specifically in tech on the show, and they have this amazing collection of vintage phones and televisions and cables and lights, and they're my favourite things by far.
I imagine everyone's relationship to the technology in cast and crew ages them very specifically. I was in a workplace environment recently where I was working with a colleague who's asked us to clarify whether a VHS went in a VCR or whether it was the other way round. And I've never felt so old, Sam.
Wow.
Was there any bit of tech that you just looked at and you wondered, what is this? While William McInnes was like, how dare you? That's something that's still new to me.
Yeah, I mean, I have used these things in shows before, but maybe I wasn't so scrutinised. But the telephone, every time I make a phone call on the show, it's either one of those spin dials, and they take forever. And Emma usually lets me just do it, and I'm sitting there rolling the phone dial trying to get the number, and it usually takes a couple of minutes. But I just try and type in my home phone number from when I was a kid because that's the only home phone number that I can remember.
That's adorable.
That's amazing. I always thought it was so strange that our emergency number was 000 when we had rotary dials, because that's the number that takes the longest to spin back.
Yeah, it takes forever. I mean, it's insane to think. I mean, it really must have made everyone very calm in the 80s, because you don't have everyone on your speed dial at any moment.
Yeah. Have you successfully bought any old 80s TVs from eBay then?
No. No. I know, it's all speculation. I think about it all the time, but then I think, where am I going to put this TV? Like one day I imagine having a control room just somewhere in the attic. I just got all these TVs stacked up.
Tom Hanks collects typewriters, so there's no reason why you can't collect televisions.
Does he have a space for those typewriters?
Yeah, probably. He's probably got like a 17-room mansion or something.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And I am thinking TVs do take up a lot of space, especially when they're from that era.
Yeah,
I was just thinking, like, would they work, or do you need to like turn them into fish tanks or something?
They do work because it's like really big in the gaming community.
Oh,
like,
wow.
there's a lot of people yeah, so they're like massive, but they're so expensive. Like I look at them, I think, like, what am I going to do? I should make sure that somebody buys this as somebody who's into like old school Sega game.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, like Alex the Kid on a Sega Master System too.
Yeah.
That's so awesome. Yeah, it's a shame you can't just like go down to the big Vinnie's warehouse and pick one up for $20.
No, they're like thousands of dollars.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a real market for it.
My family really should have held on to them.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam, you've done a lot of work in Australia now. We're thinking, obviously, the Newsreader, The Hunting, Lambs of God, but you also work across the UK and the US. What's different about each of those markets and when you work in them?
I love working at home. I really, really love working at home. I love speaking my own accent. I think that's really fun. I wouldn't say anything is specifically different. I feel like every show is always under the same kind of pressures, the same kind of schedules. Australia, maybe not as funded, but I think also we have such incredible crews here. There is just like a wealth of talent. But I don't try and like see them in a different capacity, but definitely working at home is my favourite.
Well, Sam, we hope that you keep doing that, especially if there's Newsreader Season 3 around the corner. Sam Reid, thanks so much for taking the time to stop everything.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me.
Sam Reid plays Dal Jennings in The Newsreader on ABC TV, and you can watch both seasons on ABC iView.
And don't forget to tune in to the Newsreader companion podcast hosted by Lee Sales and Lisa Miller on the ABC Listen app now.